This webinar was recorded for subrecipients of the Tennessee Strong Families Grant on June 24th, 2024. The purpose of the webinar was to learn how to present data in a way that tells the story of what a program is doing when serving its clients. Dr. Robert Lucio, an associate professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and the director of the online Masters of Science in Social Work program, was our subject matter expert presenter. The webinar discussed collecting useful data, accessing your data, interpreting the data, identifying the context of which the data was collected, intervening in light of what data has been collected, and finally, using the data to tell the story of what has been accomplished. The guiding questions and other materials are posted in our training slides section for your reference and review.
I appreciate the opportunity to chat about data. And anytime you have a question, please just stop me. This is just really an opportunity to share some things about how we think about storytelling and what we use our data and really thinking about data as a way to tell our story and not have that told by someone else. And so as we think about our data, what is the story we want to tell with that, knowing the clients that we have, knowing the data we have. So we're going to walk through a process of that. We're also going to review a little bit of what we talked about last time. So we're all sort of starting at the same space. I've updated a little bit of that to add some sort of elements to that to consider for each of those things we'll talk about today. So again, introduction of myself, Dr. Lucio. As Brooke said, I'm the director of the online MSSW program and an associate professor. I do also always want to tell a caveat here that I love data. And so I know that not everybody else lives and breathes data the same way that I do, but it still tells a story. And I hope at the end of today that you think about data not as numbers, but what it can speak to about your program and how it can be used to look at the services you're providing and what you might want to provide. And so really thinking about data in a different way. I always love this. So if you've seen the Redwoods, this just always reminds me, that the tools that we have are the tools that we use. And so sometimes if we only know one thing, it's what we do. So think about that today in terms of expanding your storytelling with data toolkit. And that's my hope for today is that when we're done. So did I see someone who's a former institutional research director? So I was also, Sarah, I was also a director of assessment at a university. So yes. But we'll speak the same language then today. Perfect.
Yes, love it.
But perfect. So really thinking about the tools that we have and trying to expand that toolkit to think about data in the way that it tells a story and what it is. And so last time we talked about levels of data engagement and thinking about where you are and where you want to be with your data. So, starting with this, I have data and I want to show something and working your way up to say, this data that I have, what are the questions that it answers for me? And then we get to a space where what kind of data do we need to collect to answer questions? And so just really thinking about where you are. Don't need to go into detail today because I have a lot of other stuff to cover. But as we go through today, start to think about where we're starting and where you want to be in your data storytelling. And so ultimately, what is a data story? And we talk a lot about data and data numbers and what it really is, but it's really this idea that the narrative we tell, the visuals we show, the data we collect, that intersection is the story we tell or we want to tell about the services we're providing and the clients we're seeing. So I'm from a social work background, and I always say, I did a lot of school social work, and we're in a space where oftentimes the story about the services we provide were told by other people. And when that happens, our jobs ended up being dictated by those who told the story. And so since we know the data, we're living that, it's really thinking about how can I use what I have in a way that's meaningful to share the work we're doing, the great work we're doing, and learning from that, being at a space where if things aren't where we want them to be, thinking about why that's happening and what we can do to get to where we want to be. Or are there interesting things that we didn't even think about that are coming up with the clients that we're seeing, with the services we're providing, that data will tell that story and say, oh, we hadn't even thought about that. And so I'll provide some questions as we go along, and then we'll finish with some examples. But thinking about this, that there are challenges in storytelling. It's audience, it's interpretation, sometimes it's something else, but also recognizing that the story we tell may change on the audience we're telling that story to. And so if we're talking to our staff, we might have a different story we're talking about the services we're providing versus if it's our funder. Not to say we're going to change the fundamental nature of that story, but the angle of that story may change by the person who we need to tell that story to. So if we're asking about funding, we're probably going to really focus on the services we're providing and why we need this extra funding. If we're talking to our staff and we say, these are the services we're providing, we would like to provide more of these. So really just thinking about the audience first can help shape that story. And that same data that we collect around our agency may tell different stories to different audiences. And that's okay. Just being aware of that and how we interpret that really starts with questions that we're going to ask. And it might be something else. It might be access to the data. It might be things that we'll talk about today. It might be that the way we're collecting it isn't part of our standard practice, and how do we make that happen? And so we can't tell our story until we've collected the data that we really want to talk about in these stories. Or we go through something and we said, we've been collecting this data, but wouldn't it be really neat to have additional data on this to really enhance the story we're telling or to fill in the gaps from what we have? So really thinking about a story in that way, and knowing that a narrative that centers on numbers is really what we're talking about. And you're condensing data into a story. You're telling and really a narrative about the key points of that data, and the analysis that happens as of that story and that data support. So always thinking really about the data says this, and we want to tell this story because. So why is it so important to tell this story using the data that isn't just numbers, right? The numbers play a role, but they're just the beginning point of what that meaning is around the story that we're trying to tell. And so as I go on, I'll share more of that and get a little more detailed. And so we want to think also about setting, point of view, audience. And to me, these are the most interesting things, is that, we've been telling stories for, 40,000 years, and that's the way we pass things along. And the other thing that's very interesting when we talk about storytelling, it activates a part of the brain, the same part of brain when we actually experience something. And so those ideas of, when they say visualize this happening, it's actually activating the same neural pathways that happen when you're actually doing that activity. So as we think about storytelling and talking about data, there was some talk about, like, when we use graphs to show data, that people are, I think, 10 or 12 times more likely to remember that data when it's in a graph than if we just spit out a number. And so similarly, when we tell a story about the data and what the impact of that is through a story, it has a similar impact on our memory, on our response, on our ability to process that. I always use the example when I do community engaged work, and we put up we'll say a zip code map. The first thing that people look at is what? When I put up a zip code map. If I put up a zip code map and I say, here's the use of services in the county, what's often the first thing that people will look at?
I'm looking at income based on zip codes.
And what income, though? Where will you look is the question, Haley.
Oh, for some sort of like key at the bottom?
Or you'll look mostly at your own neighborhood.
Oh, right.
Or where your service is.
Where I
serve, so even though we have this huge state map, we might look at our county first, right? So where our eye goes, even in that story, is illuminated by the interest that we're interested in. And so if I hit a chart, the first thing you look at, right, is the numbers themselves. But if it's a map or a visual, or we tell a story, the first thing we think of is, how does that relate to the work that I'm doing? And so it may be the clients that you have, it may be where you live. And so it's a very interesting space of how do we change just from the numbers to how to visualize this data or tell that story in a way so that we're taking control of that story that's being told. So, and compel change when the audience understands data through a story. So that's the goal for all the things we're doing. And so I think I ended the last time on thinking about where your organization or your agency or you personally are in your level of data engagement, thinking about what supports you might need. And then we think about how those stories can talk about the additional need, what we have. And then again, how ready are you to tell that story? So that's, again, just take a second, reflect on that. Nothing we need to do about that, but to start to think about where you are on your data story journey and where you want to be. And so what could get to that? And so when we think about needs, what is the story we're going to tell about those needs? And how do we share that story? And so the elements of a data story is, we always say, it starts with a question. And so you have to have a question in mind that you're trying to answer. I know that you're all on a grant, so I think that question is sort of provided to you in terms of this is what you'll need to share. There are other questions you might have around that in terms of the types of services that were offered or received or used, why they might be utilized more than others. Those are different questions you might have, but always starting with that question in mind, thinking about, what do I really want to know and why is this important? So we start with that, understanding that every question may necessitate a different story. And so if I have a different question, the same data may provide a different story or response to that we'll pull out. So just starting with the question and really understanding that we might need different data, we might have a different focus, the story might actually be different depending on the question that we ask, and just being open to that and really thinking about, what do I want to know? And I know there's a part, this is always the struggle that I have, is that there's a piece where we have to collect data, right? So there's a grant that says we must collect data. The question is, how do we utilize that data to make sure that we're still doing what we want to do? Because if we just collect data and it's only for the grant or it's only for somebody else, I always get a little pissy when that happens personally. Like why am I doing this? Rather than really starting to think about, how can I utilize this to really help the goals that I have for my agency, for my program, for the services we're providing. And so trying to think about that data in a different way, so that it's useful for all of the things we're doing, not just collecting data to satisfy somebody else. So once we have that question, right, we take the time to think about that up front, right? Really define, contextualize that question. It really ensures that we stay focused on what we're doing. And if we can align that to a wider program objective, that also increases this idea of collaboration and engagement. And so this question really becomes the driving force of what we want to do. Instead of being thrown on at the end, I love it when the question really drives the work that we're doing, and this idea that we're trying to answer this, not what can we answer, but this is really taking that time to really have that conversation. What do we want to know? And maybe it's when the data comes in, we have those conversations and say, now that we have the data, what else do we want to know about this, and how else can we utilize this? And what does it really surprise us, and what does it say? Because you know your client, you know your data. The data is just a number. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a little while, how the same number can mean lots of different things. It's the context that you provide to that, knowing your clients, knowing your services, knowing that story that you're going to tell. So we also we talked about the data engagement framework, making sure you have the right data, having access to the data, being able to make sense of the data, identifying causes, making changes, and track impact. We're going to go through each of those again today, but I have questions that you can ask in each of those phases when you have that data. So I think last time we were just more broad. Here I'll have some specific questions that you can say, how do I know I have the right data? Do I have everything I need to have? How do I know I have access? So I'll talk a little bit about some of those things here now, just looking at, do I have the right data, access, makes sense? And so a lot of the work I did, so Sarah, you'll appreciate this. I worked in institutional assessment, and we would always give this data out to our faculty, and we'd say, here's the numbers on your student learning. And then a year later, we'd give the same numbers on student learning, and nothing has changed. And we're like, but I've been giving you data from day one. Why are you not using the data? And so it really caused us to start to think about, in order to really effectively get to where we want to use data to tell stories, to make changes, that you have to attend to each of these. And if you miss any of these, it won't matter what happens after that. Or if you stop, it won't matter. So if I don't have the right data, there's nothing I can do, right? From that point on, if the data doesn't answer the question I'm trying to answer, I can look at it 50 million ways. It's still not going to answer that question. If I collect data and it disappears and I don't know what happened to it, I worked at a school where we found, I think it was like 60 surveys that had been in somebody's drawer for like 5 years. And we're like, oh, that's where that data went, right? It didn't matter. We collected the right data. We couldn't get it. Or if it's difficult to get, difficult to process, if you don't make changes, if all of these things don't happen, nothing else matters. And so we're going to talk through each of those, but really more related to the data story that you would ask at each step of this. So when we talk about the right data, we're talking about, does this data answer my question? So when we question our data, right, it allows us to say, do I have everything I need? Are there any blind spots that if I had collected this data, it would have been helpful? Are we able to integrate multiple data systems? And so maybe we're collecting this data from for the grant, but there's additional data we have on our clients that when we bring it together, it speaks to a different piece of the kinds of things we wanted to know. Maybe we have satisfaction survey data that we can line up and say, part of the reason this service is really utilized so much is because of this. Or we've seen a drop off in service. I wonder what's going on. We might need to look at other data to answer that. And it may be a timing issue. It may be something that is beyond our control. But it's that saying, do we have everything we need to answer that question? And so I know you're all thinking, right? Well, what would I specifically ask of my data, right? When I have my data, what am I going to ask? Fortunately, we have some questions for you to consider. You don't need to consider all of these, but the questions are, is this the right data to answer my question? Is there other data I want that I don't have? Are there other sources of data that might provide that information? What else would I know? So I might have collected something and say, we collected all this student data or youth data. It would have been really nice if we'd asked the parents some questions. That might fill in the gaps on what's going on because we only see them for a little while and they go home. Right. So are there other external data sources? Do we have workforce data, community demographics, the school system data around success for students that we might want to pull in to address this and add to the data that we currently have that could answer the questions? Do we have interviews, open-ended surveys, feedback from our clients that we might be able to say, this sheds a little more light. We see this happening. We're not sure why, but if we had this additional data, let's pull that in and look at that. So really thinking about some of these questions when you have your data set and you start to look at it, to really start to ask all of these kinds of things around your right data. Is this really the right data? Are these the things that I want to consider? So do I have everything I need? Is there something I'm missing? Is there something I get attached to this that would help me answer these questions in a little more detail? And assuming you've done that, you've got the right data, you're now saying, okay, do I actually have access to the data in a meaningful form, right? So is it held in an Excel sheet? I think this is a Google Drive sheet. So, so is it held in a Google Drive sheet? Do we have it in a space that's easily accessible that we can all get to it? Or does one person have it and we have to ask them for the data and they're only in on Fridays when they can send it to me? So where does this live in a way and is it meaningful? So, getting a clear picture of accessibility, the format, are there any challenges in the way the data looks? The person who's entering it may have entered it. Do we have a standard way of entering it? What I had learned when I was in the school district, so I was in charge of data collection for the school district. I worked in a county and we would put by the schools. I didn't realize there were about 47 different ways to spell Clearwater. And so some people would spell it with a space, some would have a capital C, some would have just the abbreviation CLWTR. And so when we were trying to aggregate data and say, okay, well, how is Clearwater doing? It turned out we had 47 different data sets. And we'd say, well, why do we only have 3 clients or 3 students who went to Clearwater when it turned out we had probably 500, but across 47 different spellings. And so for us, this idea of having the right element of the data and accessibility, it wasn't in a format that was useful for us. And so we had to go clean it up, and then someone had to go and spend time figuring out how Clearwater was spelled so we could actually then look at it. So even though the data was in a data set, it wasn't useful for us, and we would say it wasn't accessible. It was the right data, it just wasn't something that we could use. So it's really, is it a space that you can wrangle it into something you can do something with? And so thinking about your own data management, is it a shared document that we all have access to? And we talked about how we're entering the data, when it's entered, right? So if I'm looking at the data on a Friday and we know that data isn't entered to the following Monday, do we have a process by which that's entered so that we can access it later? So really having these conversations up front will ultimately make your life easier. And that's, I think, what it's all about when it comes to doing this kind of work, is having a process that really makes sense. And so, again, I think I just did this. So is it an Excel chart? Do we pull it out in charts? our pie charts, how we pull out the data, just having it in a way that we can really think about that's meaningful to us. And so is it easy to get is the real question. So these are kinds of questions we get. Is it client performance, enrollment, or other key data stored on the program, or do we need additional data that we then need to add? Do we have robust processes for collecting that data, or do we need to start some? Do we need to think about how this data is as a way of collection and think, well, this way isn't working for us. What's going to work for us? Could we streamline it? Is it more helpful to have one person enter the data? Should we put it on forms and hand it to one person so we know one person's only entering it? Can we combine this with other data? Are there different ways to break out the data? So if you're interested in these questions, I also have a sheet with more questions in this. I didn't want to overwhelm you, but I can gladly send that out that has for each of these steps just sort of questions to think about. And as we have these, I would say as a team, it'd be really helpful to just sit down and just have some questions and say, what's going on with our data? Let's talk about each of these and have that conversation, right? So is only one department have the data that we need, or can we all access it? Be another question you could ask. So finally, then we move into sort of, do you know what to do with the data? So we've got the data, we've got access to the data. Do you know sort of how to analyze the data, right? And it may be just a simple count. How many clients are we seeing? So it could be just descriptive stats. You might be saying, I'm really interested in doing predictive analytics. I want to do t-tests. Again, in this case, I think it's just direct counts that we're talking about to look at, but you may want to take it that step further and look at other things when you combine it with other data. But do you even know how to do that? Do you know how to pull that out? Do you know how to pull that data out? So again, you might not do these, but you're thinking about, through multiple lenses, where are we looking at the gaps, the strengths, the patterns? Do we know how to pull that data out to say what's going on with this data? And it may be looking at the data as a whole. We may also want to break the data down by different demographics of the people that we're serving and saying, we're serving all these people, but I'm really interested in how this particular group of clients utilizes this data or utilizes our services. Or you might have a service and say, I'm just curious, we're offering all these services. Who in our agency is utilizing this service the most? And is that the target we've been shooting for? And if the answer is no, we'll get into why is that happening? We'll have those kinds of questions. But really thinking about your data in different ways to say, anybody a Ted Lasso fan? So I am certainly a Ted Lasso fan. And there's a space where he's playing darts, right? Do you remember that, where he's playing darts and he said, I saw this quote as he was driving his little son to school. It said, be curious, not judgmental. And I think the same thing about your data. Be curious about your data and just explore and be open to understanding what's working, what isn't. I think sometimes we get to a space, I can just speak for myself, where I'm worried that if things aren't working, that something's wrong. And it's really, instead of looking at it as an opportunity to say, if it's not working, let's figure out why. Did we miss something along the way? Are we looking at the wrong group of people? Are we not advertising in the right place? Is something happening that's outside of our control? But be curious about what's going on to answer these questions, right? So, what's missing from the current data landscape and evidence-based approach? Might also say, are there other things we might want to bring in? So really thinking about what are the gaps, strengths, looking for trends in our data. Is what this phase is really about. So you've got the data, you've got access to it. So you start thinking and saying, what is my first initial reaction when I see this data, right? So it's like, where do I see youth or clients being successful? What are the metrics that we're using to track performance? How are people doing on that? Are there particular demographics we're actually seeing more or less of? Are we reaching our goals? Might be another question. So again, what are things we're doing we could improve? So it's just getting a general sense of when you see your data, what's the first thing that comes to mind, right? When I see this, I'm like, oh, I noticed this. Then when you notice that, then you start to say, why is that happening? Now we're starting to get into really these pieces of this story of what do we think is going on that's causing that? So what's this cause and effect? So if I'm seeing this utilization of service go up, why do we think it's going up? Or if we see the utilization of services going down, having that conversation and say, why do we think these services are going down? Or if they're utilized in one quarter and not another, is something happening in that quarter that might be useful to know? Is there something going around that you're like, oh, this happened, this event happened, and therefore we expect to see an increase? Or so what we would see when I did private counseling is over the summer, our services would drop. Right. And so during the school year, there weren't as many referrals from schools to say, hey, your child's in trouble. So please get them counseling. So over the summer, it was just natural for our services to drop. Had nothing to do with the quality of services. Families went on vacation. We also saw services drop a lot during spring break, right? Families take their kids away. And so we would plan around that to say, well, if we see this drop for this month, well, maybe it's because the families were gone, right? Over Christmas or over Thanksgiving breaks or any of the holiday breaks that students might have. Just being aware of that, it has no indication of our service. It's thinking timing. So then we would have this conversation to say, okay, if we know that our clients are going to be gone for this week or going to have a lower workload, what can we do in that? How can we utilize that time to be prepared? Are there evidence-based things? Do we want to do some trainings during that time, which we've been waiting to do? Maybe this is a great time to clean our offices or clean our email that we've said, okay, we're going to dedicate time because we haven't had the time and I've been meaning to do this. Now we can plan on that. So really thinking about what might be going on to cause that. We're not talking about evidence-based practices here. We're just thinking, I have a theory that this might be going on. Now we go back to this question of, do I have the right data to answer that theory? If not, what do I need to collect? Sort of really thinking about that sort of stuff: when, how, where, why. And with that, you might ask probing questions, just robust solutions, having conversations around what do we think is going on? This is what's going on with the data. Let's just have a conversation about why. Because then once you know why, of course, right, then you're actually going to know what to do with it, right? So you're going to do something. But before then, you're going to ask questions like, what are our findings? What data do we have that supports that? Are there any barriers or policies that are getting in the way? We really love to serve this client type or this client demographic, but this is getting in the way. They have to go through these hoops to get our services. What can we do to eliminate that? Why are we not reaching our goals? Why are we reaching our goals, right? What's going on that we're doing so well that we need to do more of it is okay as well. Are we getting the clients we thought we would? We thought we would get this younger clients, but we're getting a demographic that's 18 to 30. We thought we were going to get under 18. What's going on? Why are we not getting that client service? Is it an issue of transportation? And are the services being offered and not utilized? Again, I would say on the opposite side of this, I would also explore why they're being utilized, because that can also be things related to funding requests, right? We didn't expect this number of clients to show up. Suddenly, we have a lot more clients. Now we need to do something about it. So I know there's been a lot of talk nationally around telehealth, and one of the challenges that they want to not. So currently, there's this idea that after 6 months, you have to get an in-person appointment for telehealth. There's been COVID had a little break. One of the reasons that they don't want to expand this permanently is I was just having this conversation with some legislators nationally, is their concern is it's actually going to be utilized too much. So there's a huge need, right, that they're afraid is going to be used. Well, we have to explain to them and show them why this need is there. So if our services are maxed out, then we need to talk about this service is in the community. There's a huge need. We need more funding the next time around because we can't serve all the clients who need this. So it's not always about our clients are not being served. It might be our clients are being served so well, or we're at capacity and we need more space to serve those clients. So that might be the story we're telling if we see this huge increase in our client usage of the particular service that we didn't even think about. So again, I only
Can you
have
hear me
on
now?
here. Sorry, go ahead.
I think it was an accident.
What was that, Haley? Sorry.
I think it was an accident. I don't think
Oh, okay. I thought someone was so excited about using data that they jumped in. I'm good with that.
we are that excited, but we're listening.
I appreciate it. So then you need to make changes. You actually need to do something. And I think sometimes, again, we get to this space. I'll speak about my school experience, and I did this last time. Teachers would always say, we're going to wait a year because things are going to change and something new is going to come along and they're going to require us to do something different. And so I think until we do changes, we think this sort of is well, duh, we know what's going on. Changes need to happen. sometimes they actually don't happen. And so we have to make things happen. And so thinking about evidence-informed approaches, collaborator input, peers, our clients, just thinking about a systematic, intentional manner of making things happen. Asking questions of leadership asking questions of people who are working, of our clients, of our families, just saying what's going on, what do we actually need to do? So if we know what's going on, what are the potential solutions? And then again, sort of asking what's in our toolkit? What do we know? What do we have on staff? We don't want to recommend things we don't have training. Or are there additional trainings that we need to get in order to be able to provide this service the way we want to do that? And so again, so it goes back to funding. We know we have this clientele. We know we have this gap. We'd love to provide this service. Where do we get the funding for that? So that's a story you can talk about. So depending if you're talking to our funders, or we're talking about our families, we're talking about the people who work there, or the innovative practices that we've always thinking about adopting that we want to try. How can we improve our clients reaching their goals? How can we increase the number of services or the number of clients utilizing services? All of those things we would want to think about when we talk about making changes. And finally, then we want to close the loop. Did it work? Right? So did everything we do actually make a difference? If it did, fantastic. If it didn't, let's go back and talk about where we might want to improve things. Maybe it's a thing that we just have the wrong data. We need additional data that would really answer this question. Maybe it's an issue of we want to pilot and implement things differently. Maybe it's more training, all of those things. So really thinking then about here we are, did it work? If it did, great. If it didn't, what do we need to do? Have that conversation. So that's my sort of things to think about when we're making changes. How can we build mechanisms for accountability? What scaffolding or training? Do we have staff knowledge? Do we have our staff trained in how to do this? We might have an implementation that we're like, well, this would be great, but no one's been trained in it, all of those things. So before I get into the next step, I'll just stop here for some brief questions. Anybody have any questions about sort of, this is just thinking about the data. Now we're going to talk about messaging, and now we're going to actually have some examples of some data that we want to talk about. How do we would want to message that? What does that mean for us?
There. I'm thinking about just, all these different types of data that you were kind of describing. Is there a point where it's could become overwhelming, like to try to gather too many types of data, or where's the pitfall there that you would say?
That's a great question. The answer is always too much data, right? I don't think this is ever really sometimes a question of not enough data. I think it's a question of making sure that we focus on the ones that are really the most important to the story we want to tell, right? And just because we collect all of this data doesn't mean we need to use it all either. And so if we have a lot of stuff, I think it's starting to sort out, does this answer the question? And that's a hard thing sometimes to do, to shed some things. I think there's what is the name of it? There's a term in sociology, and I'll have to look it up. But basically, once you get something, it never goes away, right? And so if you take on an additional duty, right, you always have that plus additional duties that come on. But there's a sociological term for that because my friend used to use that all the time. And so sometimes we just have all of this stuff we've just been doing because we've always done it. And so I think it's also important to say, do we really need all of this stuff? Or do we need to look at it all today? What is the really most pressing thing for us today, for our clients, for our staff, and focus on that. And I think that's the part of data collection is also, we didn't talk about this, but going back to, do we have the right data? Probably more so access to the data, thinking about how do we make it as part of our regular practice as much as possible. I think when it's an add-on, like we have to do this at the end of the day and not utilizing it, I always would get frustrated if we had all this data and we're like, well, you're making me collect all this and we're never using it. So really being intentional about using that data that we collect so that if there's an extra effort, we know it's not wasted. I used to have a boss, I would always say, right, don't ask me a question you don't want an answer to, right? If your mind's already made up and you know what you're going to do, just don't ask me the question because I could be more frustrated and later on when you don't use what I've asked because you've already made up your mind. Same thing. If we're going to collect data, let's make sure it's useful. And so make it regular part of our practice. And I think that really helps. So thinking more intentionally about that up front. So with messaging, now we're talking about, now we want to sort of tell that story. So what is the message that we want to tell? So really thinking more intentional about sort of how do we tell that story? What is the story we actually want to tell? Anticipating potential hurdles. As Sarah said, make sure the data is presented to non-data people. I had a friend who used to always say Sesame Street stats. That colors are better, and I always say green is good, red is bad. I used to use that in graphs until I found someone who's colorblind and said, well, I can't tell the difference. So keep that in mind. And so now I use like different shades of like a blue and a gray and so color blind friendly ones. But this idea that someone who is consuming the data, the story we're telling to someone,
I don't even like that practice.
they just need that story. What's that, Deanna? So just know that the person who's consuming it doesn't need to analyze it. And I think sometimes that's also a challenge. We want to just give them the data and say, here you go. And not everybody in every agency needs to be the analyzer of that data, right? Maybe you have one person who says, I love this. I'm really good at that. That should be that person's, let them do that, right? If you find someone who loves data, let them analyze it. I think, again, I'll talk about school district stuff. They wanted every social worker to be able to analyze every client's data. And some people just didn't enjoy that. Some people didn't like going to meetings. And so if someone loves going to meetings, let them go. So really thinking about that in that way that says, how do we make this so we can present it? So what's the story we're going to tell? But how can we tell it in a way that says, as I'm reading it, again, and I would say, red is bad, green is good. You just need to tell me, what do I need to do more of? Right? That's all I want to know. Everything else, great, but I don't need to have the detail. I don't need to know the p-values or something underneath it, right? I just need to be able to look at it and be able to do something with it. So here's some kinds of questions we should consider. How can we share the evidence? And I would argue thinking up front, very beginning of your services, how do you want to share that data? How are we going to use that data? Because that may also change the data that you actually collect if you're going to share it differently. So if I'm going to share this data with stakeholders or my agency, it's going to be different than I'm going to share with funders. So I may want to collect different data. So what are the key messages I want to say? What are the visualizations I might want to share? How can I structure this so there's discussions around the data? Is there a timeline I want to get feedback? So again, all of these things I would say thinking up front of how do I want to use this data? So I would always ask questions. So when I did data consultation, the first question I would always ask is, how do you plan on using this? Because that would determine what data we want. Because I think sometimes people think they want data that they really don't want. It's not going to answer the question, well, I need this data. And if my question is, well, how are you going to use it? Well, I want to look at justifying my jobs. Well, maybe that's not the right data for that. Maybe you need to look at the amount of services you're providing, not something else. Or if someone says, I want to know how we're doing, the amount of services we provide won't answer that question. So really is that upfront, how do you want to use this data? Starting with that will help you think about all of the stuff around stories. So, what are the key takeaways that you want to present and who do we want to present them to? And just thinking about that upfront. So what does this look like in practice? So I know this is what everybody's been waiting for. So now we're going to go through some of these data and sort of get into that space. And so, we're going to look at data. Maybe you want to look at data as a whole agency. Maybe you want to look at data for specific services or specific populations. And all of those may tell a different story as you look at those differently. Again, I can't tell you what to do. You know your clients, you know your agency, you know what your focus is. And so as you think about that, as you look at the data, it may ask a different question to say, I'm curious about this, and you may want to look at differently, right? So you'd say, well, it looks like everybody is utilizing this service, or this service is equally distributed across the year, and the people who you work for you are saying, we're seeing this real increase. And maybe what you're seeing is it's actually that, and it changes who's using that service at different times. But you'll know that as you start to think about your data and your clients, and all of that better than anybody else. So don't let anyone else tell that story. I want you to be at a space where you're prepared to tell that story about your data. So what are we seeing? Here's some simple questions you can ask, right? What are we seeing? Do we see anything that stands out to us that we just might want to take another look at? This looks very interesting to me. I wasn't expecting that. What a surprise that is. Or this is exactly what I thought it would be. And now this confirms what we've been thinking. Now we want to share that story. When you look at that, what does that mean for us? Why might that be happening? What resources do we need? What changes might we need? So this is a simple place of I was going to start somewhere to ask questions. As soon as I got my data, these are the sorts of questions I would start to ask. Does anything stand out? And if so, now follow along. If nothing is, you'd say, okay, this is exactly what we expected. Great. That's a story in and of itself. We thought we were going to serve these clients in this capacity. Look at this. We're doing it. If it's not that, what's going on? And so again, this should look familiar to you, right? You enter some data. So we're just going to focus for today on emotional support and safety services and workforce development, because that's all the data I had a chance to enter. And so I've entered some data. We're going to look at that and just say, what do we notice? What do we do? So again, so you can see all the data has been entered along with race, ethnicity, also along the services that were provided. So this is just, you've seen this, shouldn't be a surprise to you. At least I hope it's not a surprise to you. If it is, that's another question for another webinar altogether. So, but we have all the data. So we look at the data, number of individuals served, just sort of looking at this. So considering the questions that we'd look at, are we noticing anything interesting about this data? So we have the total number of services provided, number of new individuals served, total number of individuals served. So if you looked at this, does anything stand out to you as interesting that you might want to explore further? And I know you don't know about a lot about the agency or the data that I pulled, and I only did quarters 1 through 3. But so as you think about this, the first thing you would want to look at is, does anything stand out to you?
Yeah. There's many of those individuals served seem to be new individuals. So like with only like 1 or 2 being exceptions to that.
Perfect. Perfect. So what you would notice, and so exactly this, right, is that we're getting a lot of new clients, but they're not coming back.
Mm.
Right? Now, if I'm a crisis agency, this is perfect, right? If I'm working crisis management, this is exactly what I want, right? I want to get them, I want to refer them on somewhere else. So if I saw this data and I'm a crisis management place, I'd be like, this is kind of what we expected, right? But if I'm a long-term counseling place, I might say, why are they not coming back after the first counseling session? Is there something we're missing here? We're providing a lot of services, right? On average, each client is getting 2 or 3 services each, right? So it's not an issue of they're not getting services. Now, again, mind you, I only looked at, right, counseling and workforce development. So maybe if it's workforce development and you're like, well, we helped them with the resume, they got a job, they don't need to come back. So it may not surprise you to look at this data, but just as Haley said, right, a lot of them are new individuals, right, not coming back. That may be a surprise to you if that's what you expected. So just thinking about your data overall in this first trend might be a way to say, what's going on that they're not coming back, or we're a crisis place and we need to follow up with them. We want to make sure they're doing okay. That should be reflected in this data. What is our follow-up plan in the service? So you might say, well, in Q4, we expect to start to see that because we have a 6-month follow-up, and we wouldn't have seen this in this data yet. Perfectly okay. In Q4, we'd expect to see a lot more number of individuals served because we're serving the same people again because we're reaching out to them. Again, your data. All of these may have a different story depending on the agency, the services you provide, but it's a great way to just start to say, what stands out to me? So fantastic picking that up, Haley. So now we look at this, we look at race, ethnicity, and we say, anything stand out to you in this data? So this is overall services that we've provided to all our clients. Again, small number of clients across the spectrum in the services we provide. Anything stand out?
Yeah, it seems like it's maybe more diverse in quarter 1 as far as the client population.
So perfect. So one thing might be that our clientele is getting more diverse, and then we talk about why that is, right? We'd have a conversation around, is it word of mouth? Is it where we're going, right? So perfect. Anything else that might stand out?
I would just look at the diversity too and make sure that, we had staff trained appropriately to work with those demographics. Just making sure that they're aware of the different, struggles that each one may have that are unique to them.
So perfect. To say if we have a diverse clientele, we want to make sure we serve them. Sorry, Haley.
No, yeah. Adding to that, Brooke, we created a strong family flyer, for example, to promote our expansion of our program. And, you know, you got to create it in Spanish. You got to have other languages. You know, you got to have the referral process be allowed to, you know, be translated service. So yeah, this is just another way to promote cultural competency.
Perfect. And so what I pointed out for me was, if you notice, there's a increase in you know, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Latini, right? And so now the question is, you would ask, well, what's the result of that? Did we hire a Spanish-speaking counselor in Q3? Did we create these flyers in Q3 and now it's really working? Or is it that, you know, this community has learned to trust us and now they're coming to us more, right? So you know your data, but I would say when you see that come out, you'd say, okay, what does this mean for us given our services, right? And so that's the kinds of things. Now, if you saw a decline in services, you'd have to say, well, what's going on? Why are we seeing this population shift away and this one grow, right? It's just you, again, you know your data, but exactly, Haley, maybe Q2 is when you created your flyer and suddenly now you've had this influx of clientele because now this service is available to them that wasn't before. But you want to talk about that story when you share your data, right? You want to say, this is the impact of us doing that, right? And now it's growing even more. We need to make sure maybe this is the case. And I'm going to say this is small numbers, but if it was 20, 40, 50, you could argue, well, now we need another Spanish speaking counselor because we're reaching our maximum number of clients that this person could see, right? So, or we need to have a training because we have this going on. And so really thinking about the data and what it means for your agency, given the context of your agency. So that's why I say data in and of itself is just data, right? The context and meaning within your agency and the clients you serve and your knowledge of that is the most crucial part of data interpretation, right? So data is data in and of itself. And there's so many reasons this can happen, but you knowing your data, your clientele, the services you've provided, the flyers you've just created might be, or you might see this and say, you know, we really have, and we'll just say the Hispanic Latino was low. You might say, you know, we really want to serve this clientele, but they're not coming in. Maybe we need to create some more flyers, right? And maybe that's the issue. Let's talk, let's figure that out, right? If this has been a target of yours and you're not reaching it, that might be a conversation you would have internally to say, what's going on, right? Talk to some clients, go out to the community and say, hey, this, maybe they didn't know about the service, right? Maybe it wasn't advertised in where you thought it would be. Maybe you gave it to schools to hand out and it never got sent out. All kinds of things could be happening, but this would be a place for you to explore. What are the trends? What does it mean? Why might it be happening? So again, now I'll look at this and we'll say, okay, anything you noticed about this?
Lots of
Definitely the age of 25 through 59 being the prominent client factor.
Perfect. Which may be exactly what you want, right? You might be saying, this is our clientele. This is who you want to serve. But if you're like, you know, we were really shooting for young adults who are in college, this isn't going to be the one you're trying to get to. And this would be a good way to speak. This may actually just confirm what you thought, right? We're seeing it grow among the population we really wanted to serve. Fantastic. Let's keep doing what we're doing. If it's not, and you say, what's going on with youth? Why are we not serving young adults? This is a different conversation to have. So again, the data in and of itself is the data, but when you notice that, then you put it into the context of your agency, what that means for you. So again, and we'll go another one. So this is the opposite way. So we talked about populations, and I'll do one more looking at a specific service. And so anything you notice around specific services. Because we might want to look at it, before we were looking population-based, first was whole, now we're looking just at services that we provide.
The low amount of therapy services is what I noticed right away.
So we have low therapy,
Very
and what
low.
else?
It looks like Q3 has a lot more participation across the board.
Perfect. And so if we're talking about crisis intervention, what happens in Q3 that might explain that?
Holidays.
Right? Holiday, we know, right? There's an increase of suicidal ideation around holidays. And so it might simply be explained by the holiday. Now, it might also be explained that nothing. Suddenly you went out and did a community awareness campaign, and now you've got all these people coming in because they know about your services. You printed flyers or cards and you put them out at the bus stops, and suddenly you've got all these services. So again, it could be any number of things, but I would just say, hey, pay attention to this trend because we're seeing this increase. Now let's have this conversation of why, right? And that to me is that data story, because the data says there's an increase. The story is, why in our agency is this happening now, or why is this not happening now? Let's have that conversation, right? And so it could be multiple things, right? So for me, first thing I thought of was holiday, but it might not be. You'd be like, hey, we did this campaign. We just went out and we're at this fair in February, and that's when our services went up because we went to this fair and started to talk about our service. We had a contract or an agreement with this other agency who's going to refer to us. We had them printed on school IDs, our number, and so now they're contacting us because students are seeing this. Again, whatever reason that is, have that conversation after you've looked at the data. And I think we can do one more. So again, we're going to talk about assistance with workforce, and what we notice is a decline in services by a quarter. It might be, that this was around resume building. So, and job skills, once they got the job, they didn't need to come back. It might be, well, we had all these services, so we shifted people somewhere else. Again, any number of reasons. If we don't see a follow-up service with the same clients, it could be because they didn't need it. It could be any number of other things. But it's just worth having that same conversation. What are we seeing? What does it mean? Why might it be happening? What do we need? And this is a great place to sort of advertise and say, hey, in order to keep doing this, we need more of this. Or where do we need to move things around? And what changes might we need? So, okay, so I've got about 6 minutes left. So I'll stop for questions because it'd be a good time, I think, to have questions and answer, and but just thinking about data stories, anything I can add to that, any questions about that?
Hey, it's Haley. I feel good on analyzing data. I don't have a background in it. I'm a social worker like you, Robert, but I just love to analyze and, think of ways to improve our program. But specifically, I don't know why I just assumed storytelling with data, we would be like talking about how do we use our data to then like tie it to a narrative of a story, which I think you did answer, in terms of like analyzing that data, but specifically with a particular client or case story maybe, and not with an overall trend of the program. Do you have any advice on how to incorporate those two, like a client case story and then your data from the year?
Yeah, and so my approach would be to go the opposite way, to start with the trend and then the case story that says, as an example of somebody who really got a lot out of our service, here's what so-and-so said about this. So that's how I would use it, to say, we've really seen this increase in clients in the Hispanic, Latino, Latinx market, or, demographic. Here's 3 who came in because of this flyer. Let me tell you their story. Right? Because the data really sets up that personal experience. But I think sometimes what I've seen is if we don't have the full picture, people will, if they don't agree, it doesn't sit with them, will then say, well, that's a one-off, right? And versus I'm sharing the whole picture with you. Now I'm going to solidify what that really looks like in practice. Let me take you out into the field, because basically you're going to say, here's the story. Now I'm going to take you out to the field and show you what it's really like. So someone who was unhoused, who has now got housing, let me tell you how that's changed their life. Let's look at the trend. Let me give you somebody. So that's how I would do it. I would start with the broader one and then bring in, because I think you're right, bringing that individual story and your own experience is also good. It doesn't, you could say, hey, I've been working with clients and this is what I've seen. This is why I think this is happening. They now trust us. I had 3 clients tell me the other day, I feel safe with you. And so now we're seeing this increase. So I think that's how I would combine those together.
No, that's great. That's very helpful, because I was going from the opposite and it was sort of hard to make that connection. I think starting with the data, then going to the individual story is excellent. In fact,
it actually made me think of a saying I've heard where it's like words talk and numbers scream. Yeah.
So scream first, then talk.
Yeah. Well, that's the screaming first. Yeah.
Yeah. to get people's attention, and then you and then you
It's-
share that personal.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we can get too caught up in the numbers and forget that we're talking about people that are being impacted. And so, yeah, I think the numbers are obviously important in the trends, but you also have to make those personal connections, Haley, like you were talking about, because you are talking about lives being impacted. And potentially your trends aren't really, like, your percentages could be changing or could be steady, but the number of services is expanding. And so, like, you have to give the trends and all, but also link it to individual people as a reminder that you're talking about actual lives and not just numbers.
Yeah. And I love that, Haley. I'm going to steal that for my next presentation. I'm going to put in there, make sure you add the individual stories. Because again, I think that's a really important piece. And that story may also, again, change depending on who you're talking to, right? If someone's just about budget, they just care about the numbers, right? If someone's thinking about services and things like that, or it's legislation and policy, that may be a different story. We want to bring them into that. So I think it would just also depend on who you're telling that story to. But I love that piece of it, bringing in that personal experience of either the people you're working with or yourself.
Just because, even as you're presenting those like descriptive statistics to the FAU, for your quarterly reports, they know what your program is doing, but the people beyond them at the state and the legislation, and again, they don't know those individual stories of like, who are those 7 people who got, emotional support services or whatever. So I love that. It sounds like a lot of you are already thinking in that realm, beyond just the numbers. So we want to know, we want everyone to know the great work that the organizations are doing, because there's a lot going on. So it's great.
Yeah, I think I'm up on time. So I will send out if it's helpful, I'll send you, Brooke, the list of questions, and you can send those out. And obviously have the recording. Would the slides be also helpful?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll send them all to you this afternoon. I got to clean up one. I realized one of my titles was wrong. I was reading and I'm like, wait, I'm not going backwards. So I'll fix that, and then I'll send that out to you a little later today.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Lucio. This is a great presentation. It was really helpful for all these organizations to really think about, okay, we've collected all this data. Now, where do we go next? And maybe what do we need to add in? What do we need to tweak? And how can we, really tell our story? So again, like you said, someone's going to tell the story. So we need to tell it as accurately as possible. So thank you so much for this awesome webinar. And I will send out all of that follow-up information this afternoon. And I hope everyone has a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.